Welcome to the 1620 Project video interview series. I'm David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars, and I'm delighted today to have Professor Kevin Gutzman, who has a wonderfully lengthy CV, but I'll mention he's an expert on the middle period of American history, that's 1760 to 1877, with particular expertise in American constitutional and Southern history. His books include James Madison and the Making of America, Who Killed the Constitution? The Fate of American Liberty from World War I to George W. Bush, and Virginia's American Revolution, From Dominion to Republic, 1776 to 1840. He has also written a lovely essay on the 1619 project, which we were happy enough to have the opportunity to republish, talking about other things, among other things, about the other 1619. And I have a bunch of questions I can ask you. But what is the other 1619?
Well, I said in the essay that for several years I've made a big deal of the year 1619 in my introductory American history survey courses. And the reason is that in Virginia in 1619 we have not only the first appearance of unfree black laborers, but also the first meeting of the Virginia General Assembly, which included elected burgesses. Those were the first representatives in an assembly ever in the Western Hemisphere. And the first session of the Virginia General Assembly adopted a statute that said that the Church of England would be the Church of Virginia. So we have Christianity, agricultural laborers, and representative government, all from 1619, which are, of course, the key elements of the rest of Virginia's colonial history. Actually, by that time, they also had identified tobacco as the colony's staple crop, which it would continue to be down to the 1950s. So I see 1619 as being a foundational point in the history, not only of Virginia, but because of Virginia's central place in colonial American history of the United States in general.
I would add, do you think that current, K-12 history, university history, advanced placement, do they actually cover this enough? In both 1619 in particular and the broader themes that 1619 illustrates?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think American kids are taught a highly skewed version of American history nowadays. There's very little attention paid either to the significance of Christianity or to the almost unique nature of representative government in the world at that time. And instead we get stress on slavery, which leads kids to think, as polling of them shows, that American slavery was uniquely American. If it's not an intentional result of what's being done in K through 12, it's evidence of just enormous malpractice.
So American history has not been being taught brilliantly for a while. What's different about the 1619 project?
They say they want to recenter American history. They want to make the story of slavery be the main thing. It's not insignificant, of course, it's significant, but it's not the main thing. What's significant about America's story in general is the way that it's different from the rest of human experience. And at the time that Jamestown was settled, at the time that that first meeting of the Virginia General Assembly took place, slavery existed everywhere, always had, and was essentially uncontested. So to teach kids that, well, America is uniquely responsible for it and should be apologizing to the rest of the world has the story exactly backwards.
When you teach your own, surveys, you must be teaching students who have gotten something like a 1619 project version of history. How do you teach them out of that?
Well, one begins by talking about the Western Hemisphere context of English settlement in North America. So when I describe the movement in England to establish colonies in North America, I set the stage by describing Spanish, Portuguese colonies, French colonies south of here, and especially the economic organization of those colonies, which of course was centered on, as much as it could be, on sugar production using slave labor in massive quantity. So by the time that I get around to talking about Jamestown and of course later Plymouth, people have the idea that insofar as there was slavery, there was forced labor in North American English colonies. This was really kind of a peripheral phenomenon in North America, in the Western Hemisphere, in that time. And I, by then, have already made the point that slavery was essentially universal. It had not really been considered even philosophically dubious. So we have, for example, I'll make the point that in the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all slave owners. Muhammad says, come join the Muslim armies and you can have a share of all the slaves we can take. Aristotle thinks that most people were born to work and only a few were born to think, and he justifies slavery in ancient Greece, which of course was entirely forced labor of other white people. And so what's different is that it was Western Europeans, chiefly Anglophones, who decided we're not going to tolerate this anymore, and eventually made an issue of it. So, and of course, even today, there's still a substantial amount of slavery in the world. It's not so pervasive as once, but a recent study I saw said that there are over 30 million slaves now. Yeah. So, of course, none of this is to excuse anybody's behavior, but I think it's highly unhistorical to go root about in evidence about the past and consider everybody in the past in terms of the extent to which he managed to approximate our wonderful moral stature. It's really an unhistorical way of thinking about the past. Far more interesting to me is the question how it could be, for example, that somebody like George Washington is born into the status he was born into, the relationship to slavery he was born into, and then decide that he found calling and wanted to get rid of it, which that really needs an explanation because it's different.
When you're teaching about the growth of abolitionist sentiment, I mean, I guess how big, so when you're doing your History of the United States 1, how big a part of that do you make the growth of abolition and, you know, in the hearts as a political movement?
Well, okay, so there's abolition in the sense of kind of feeling that slavery is inconsistent with political, philosophical sentiments, commitments that people are beginning to have in the late 17th and especially in the mid to late 18th centuries. There's that on one hand, and then on the other hand, there's the abolitionist movement. I think the size of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War has been drastically exaggerated, and most kids think when the sectional conflict occurred in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, essentially you had an abolitionist North and a pro-slavery South, and so a war was inevitable. I actually get that all the time. And it's not only from 18-year-olds in introductory American history classes at my regional state university that I hear this, but of course it's in the media, it's everywhere. People think that. And so students find it surprising. I was actually just talking to some a couple of days ago. They find it surprising that Illinois had a law excluding all black people at the time that Lincoln was debating Douglas, and then that Oregon was admitted to the Union during the Civil War with a constitution that banned ingress of any blacks, which provision, of course, wasn't enforced after the war very much, but was not finally removed from the Oregon Constitution until within the last 25 years. So this residue of hostility to blacks, of course, is significant in American history, and I certainly don't downplay it. I actually point up some kind of perverse instances of it or examples of it. But again, I think when one thinks about the past, it's far more interesting to ask, how is it that people began to have different attitudes from the ones into which they were born? That I think needs explanation. The idea that somebody, is born an absolute despot in France and lives as an absolute despot and dies an absolute despot, that's not a moral judgment. I think it's not even really a very interesting story. So I don't belabor that kind of thing.
Now, the 1619 Project claims, that they have scholarly support. Do you have a sense of, how many American historians are supporting their point of view, and how persuasive are they, within the Academy of Historians?
Well, I think there are some people in the subfield that's called the New History of Capitalism who are exaggerating the significance of slavery in America's economy in the early 19th century. So, for example, there's a book by Edward Baptist, who's a professor at Cornell University, called "The Half Has Never Been Told," in which, because of some fundamental accounting errors, he multiplies the significance of slavery to America's GNP in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s by several times. He takes what is about 6% of the American GDP and makes it half. So because he's at Cornell, he's influential, and then there have been some other people who have written in a similar vein, and they're the ones who are the primary, who have provided the primary intellectual scaffolding for this New York Times project. It's highly lamentable. Actually, there have been significant economists who have rebutted what Baptist et al. Have written, but it's still out there, and it's still obviously having its pestilential influence.
Do you think that there are large numbers of American history scholars who could be marshaled to say, look, this, we're not necessarily much different on the political side of the fence, but this is just a problem historically, in terms of pure professional history?
Well, I think the New History of Capitalism is a small subfield, so I don't think there's been pervasive attention to this.
Right.
But as I say, I know that there have been articles published in economics journals that have refuted the claims of some of these scholars about the enormous contribution of slavery to American society in the early half of the 19th century. And I would suppose that if more people were made familiar with it, more would agree. It's actually not really debatable that Baptist, for one, made basic accounting errors.
Now, here's something which I find to be a possible thing you have in common with the 1619 Project. I think, as far as I can tell, that you think that the history of Virginia matters more than is commonly given in the American history narrative, and that it should be played up more, and that the history of New England perhaps have been overstated in American history. And it seems to me that having a history which emphasizes slavery also is a history that emphasizes the American South more. So do you see yourself as having any commonality that way, or am I reading too much in?
Well, I certainly agree with that, but for the reasons people like Jack Green of Johns Hopkins, prominent scholar of American colonial history, has that impression. The Virginia was the first colony. It was the most extensive colony. It was the most populous colony. It had more blacks than any other colony. It had more whites than any other colony. Eventually, it was going to contribute more to the king's coffers than any other colony. And when the imperial crisis came around, it provided more of the leadership. Then once the United States, in the fight for independence, of course, it provided most of the leadership. And then once the United States were an independent country, 8 of the first 9 presidential elections were won by Virginians, and I could give you a roster of people who were leading, House Majority Leaders, Senate Majority Leaders, committee leaders, Chief Justice Marshall. The whole story is basically Virginian. And people in the newspapers here in Connecticut, where I'm sitting in the early 19th century, bewailed this fact, right? They really, really resented the idea that all the leadership in the federal government had to come from Virginia. I don't think there's really much dispute about the fact that it did. So a lot of the cultural influence of the contrary story is owing to the outcome of the Civil War and the subordination of Southern universities and so on in the second half of the 19th century. It's really tracing back to that. So again, I don't think this is really controversial, even if it's not the most common approach in elementary and secondary schools.
Oh, it's not controversial. I guess I just thought it would be sort of, I suppose I wouldn't mind perhaps a Virginia project to bring Virginia back more into the American history. But I guess the serious point is, do you also get the sense that this is something which should be taught more now, both at the K-12 and at the college levels?
Certainly. Well, that's how I do it, at least. So you named some of my books. I've actually carved out a kind of niche as a Virginian historian. And I don't know how one approaches the first 50 years of American history without focusing on Virginia. That's where the intellectual weight was. That's obviously where the political weight was. And the constitutional system we still live with, was mainly constructed by Virginians.
That's terribly important. In terms of how one has to combat the 1619 project going forward, I guess, one of the important things is how do you communicate to, school boards, to parents, to education officials at the K-12 levels, state level. How would you approach persuading them, no, the 1619 project just doesn't seem to be working. Here's what you should do instead?
Well, I generally take the attitude of il faut cultiver nos jardins, right? So how to do that? Whenever I get a chance, I present this argument in public. I present it to my students. I write about it. I don't know what more one person can do with this connection. It seems to me that actually it's a story. And yes, there was slavery in Virginia virtually from the beginning of Virginia, but that I think has to be contextualized. So I'm not, however, too hopeful about any short run or medium term reform in colleges of education. I think this is a field in academia that's further to the left than most. So whatever appears in the New York Times will have outsized influence there, it seems likely to me.
Yes, and do you also, when you're teaching graduate students or interacting with rising members of the historical profession, I mean, in fact, how much have they bought into a 1619 project view of history, and how do you work with history graduate students just to make sure the next generation ideally is teaching something better?
Well, there certainly is a tendency of people to think that slavery is the story, or slavery and then segregation, and now here we are, it's Freddie Gray, So I definitely do see this, but I think that most people who want to study American constitutional history, the Revolution, the early Republic with me, kind of know where, they know what my focus is going to be. They know what I've written about and I'm interested in. So I don't want people who are listening to this to have the impression that I slight those topics, but if you present a more rounded picture, it's more believable too. If you have a kind of cartoon understanding of the past, people are going to be left asking themselves, well, when did the cartoons cease and when did things start to be the way they are now? So I think you can avoid that by giving a more rounded attention. If that, this is one reason why I'm not sure how influential the 1619 project will be. It's so unremittingly dreary and negative and just Manichaean that I would think that the average kind of uncommitted person would find it unpersuasive. I haven't seen, of course, I haven't seen any polling results about people's responses to this, but it'll be interesting to see over time how much the lay public takes from it.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. When you were writing your article, a central part of it did turn on, the Declaration of Independence itself and the actions within the revolutionary generation.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I want to curve back to that. How precisely does that contradict the 1619 Project presentation of history?
Well, the 1619 Project, again, starts with the claim that the fundamental moment in American history was the arrival of what they now say were slaves. I understand this scholarship is not determined on that question, but what they say were slaves in 1619 in Virginia. And then they say that essentially the people who made the Declaration of Independence, which in the secondary school version of American history is the founding moment, they didn't really mean the claim that all men were created equal to mean all men were created equal. And so I gave evidence. I could give much more evidence, but I gave evidence in the article that, well, actually it happens. You've chosen an especially bad group to knock on this score, because those 5 fellows who drafted the Declaration of Independence certainly did believe that to be literally true. And they took very, very significant steps to make that legally true in the United States. I don't know that you could find 5 people who have done more in that connection.
And I gather you could, in fact, if you were doing, say, a teaching packet, a lesson plan, you could do primary sources just from those 5 people.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. In fact, it happens. Roger Sherman, who's one of them, the fellow who wrote the Connecticut law, Gradual Emancipation Act, which meant the end of slavery in Connecticut, his papers have recently been published by a friend of mine, Mark David Hall. So those are readily available. Of course, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, John Adams' handiwork that got rid of slavery in Massachusetts, is the answer to a trivia question. What is the oldest operative written constitution in the world? It's the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which Adams wrote. He, of course, was the chairman of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, and so on. So if you consider all 5 of them, you're going to find that, as I said, they took major steps. And people have, for the last few years, been knocking Thomas Jefferson on this score. And I'm not saying anything about his personal behavior, but when it comes to his political record, literally there was more legislation, there was more anti-slavery action of great moment by Thomas Jefferson in the Revolutionary era than from anyone else. I guess you could say that 3 guys named Lincoln, Sherman, and Grant did more against slavery, but other than them, I think he's the most important anti-slavery actor. And of course, Lincoln said that his actions on slavery were based on Jefferson's writing. So it's just a canard. It's just a canard to say that they didn't mean what they were saying. They're a pack of liars, and really it's all about wanting to have slaves. That's ultimately just a freakishly false account of America.
And also, by the way, you have a wonderful connection between the Virginia model of government and thought, Thomas Jefferson, to Abraham Lincoln.
Right. So, well, Lincoln claimed that loudly himself.
So, yeah, so that is, I think, a good way of developing that. I guess I would say also the 1619 project also then talks about the ongoing effects of racism, et cetera, in America after 1865. You also, I take it, teach the second course in the American History Survey. How do you frame the importance of race in American history for the second half?
Well, I don't actually teach the second half of the U.S. History Survey. I teach American constitutional history and Southern history that come up to the present.
All right,
But
well,
I don't
let's
teach
do those then.
Well, it's true that the period after the American Civil War did more or less fulfill Thomas Jefferson's prognostications about what would happen if there were an attempt to have a biracial society of free people in the same place. I mean, he thought, as you probably know, that what was going to happen was that slaves must be freed and then they must be colonized, because he said that he thought the whites in the South were irredeemably prejudiced against them. And he said, speaking for white Virginians, they hate us, we give them new reason every day. So people nowadays knock Jefferson for saying that. But what ended up happening instead was 100 years of a new kind of subordination. So this is more or less what Jefferson anticipated. And it's a really interesting problem. It's an interesting mental exercise to try to come up with a better solution to the slavery issue than the one the United States ended up with. Basically, I don't think that Jefferson's forecast was disproven by what actually happened. So if that's true, then he's not harshly anti-Black at all in making this claim, which is in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia.
Right. In effect, it's more that he has a accurate estimate of human nature.
And actually, Annette Gordon-Reed, who's leading scholar of Jefferson's personal life in relation to slavery, says, sometimes people knock Jefferson for saying that there had to be colonization because white Virginians and Black couldn't get along in Virginia. Her point is, I don't think I've ever heard of anybody who knew Virginia voters better than Jefferson did. He knew them certainly better than we know them. So maybe he was right about that. And again, it doesn't seem that anything that happened in reality disproved what he forecast, right? Disproved his claims.
How about, so when you're doing Southern history, though, how much weight do you give to the, say, post-1865 attempts to have Black-white political alliances, the thought that you could have had something go out that is different from the Jim Crow outcome?
That you could have had something different. Well, it would have required ongoing Northern occupation of the South. So there actually are useful lessons we can draw from this. The American Revolution can be seen as the first modern evidence that colonial wars of occupation won't work if the colonized are resistant. In other words, in the end, the American colonists cared more about America than the British did, just as ultimately the Afghans cared more about Afghanistan than the Soviets did. And I suppose in the end, they're going to care more about it than the Americans do. And we've had, of course, numerous illustrations of this reality, and that's effectively what ended up happening in the South. After a while, all Northern voters just decided we've had enough of this question. We want to withdraw our forces from the South. And now, this means the former slaves are going to be turned over to the tender mercies of their former master class. Exactly as Jefferson predicted. This is going to lead to a harsh kind of an outcome. And he thought, actually, when he wrote his book, Notes on the State of Virginia in the 1780s, he thought colonization was a possible answer. But by the time he died, he actually had changed his mind. He thought, as far as Virginia was concerned, diffusion was a possible answer. Today, historians tend to downplay this. I once had a conversation about it with my undergraduate mentor, the Lincoln scholar at the University of Texas, George Forgy. And I said, eventually Jefferson had this totally impracticable idea that there should be colonization. And he said, well, Kevin, in the 19th century, more than 1 million Irish came to the United States. So how unreasonable was it? Bob Paquette at Hamilton College is now writing about this idea of diffusion, that as the share of Black people in the population of a state declined, became more likely that the state would get rid of slavery. Jefferson was looking to that possibility in his last years. He thought essentially Virginians migrating west and establishing Kentucky and then Missouri and so on. If they took their slaves with them, old Virginia could be left with a small enough slave population that it too could outlaw the institution. So it's not as if things were written in stone. They didn't have to turn out the way they did. And there was a really grim series of events that followed emancipation. There's no way around that.
Yeah.
But again, I think in world context, that's where we started. In world context, how different is this from the experience of other countries? People in the United States had the idea that this is, let's say, suboptimal. This is not consistent with our thinking about the way government ought to work, or the way a society ought to be structured. And I think if you look at the history of, say, China or Turkey, you end up with the idea that, well, most non-Western societies have thought, sure, what's the problem? Uyghurs in camps? Nobody's complaining. So even in this, there's still something peculiar in a positive way about the United States.
Nifty. And that is lovely to think of. I have a query about, you've been mentioning your fellow scholars, and I want to follow up on that. The 1619 Project isn't the only latest scholarship on American history, on American slavery. Can you say what are other good works of history being done right now, on the same subject area, so we can know what else we should be looking for in terms of the best modern stuff on the subject?
Oh, well, you mean colonial history or
slavery, everything touched by the 1619 Project, basically.
Wow.
That's a little broad ranging, I know.
Well, I mentioned earlier in our conversation Jack Green, who's now an emeritus historian at Johns Hopkins. I think he's the leading historian of colonial America ever. And he wrote a really outstanding book, probably 25 years ago now, Pursuits of Happiness, which is essentially about the way that colonial Virginia was structured. And his argument is that it's insofar as Virginian and Massachusetts histories are different, it's Virginian, not Massachusetts, that's similar to other states, not only during the colonial period, but as America moved west. So, for example, early Massachusetts population was made up of families. They had more or less level social structure. They had towns and churches and business and so on in urban areas. And they had a welcoming disease environment. They didn't face much hostility from the Aborigines. On the other hand, Virginia had the opposite of all those. So earliest Virginia was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly rural, had a very hostile disease environment. The local Indians were hostile to them from the beginning. And the same as population moved westward, the new places were all going to have experiences like the Virginians. So, for example, early Wisconsin was all male. The Indians were hostile. The disease environment was bad. Early California was all male. Early Texas. So essentially, he thinks we've been taught this story backward. And there's an interesting intellectual history to be written about how it came to be that our textbooks elevated Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay into some kind of paradigmatic experiences when actually they were extremely peculiar.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. I am going to say peculiar is peculiar is not quite the way to end this interview, I think. Although I think I'm getting closer to an ending point. What overall should be our takeaway in terms of how we should think about American history that is proper and not 1619 project-ish?
Well, I think, again, we want to set American history in its context. We want to set settlements of these North American English colonies in their context, and the context was a world in which basically everybody was subject to somebody. Violence in labor relations was almost universal. People had the idea that even owning other people was normal and didn't really think anything of it. And one inherited one's lifelong social status. It was in America that people had ideas that are more consistent with our own. And these ideas were extremely unusual. Nobody was thinking in Russia or Turkey or China or India or Arabia. Things oughtn't be that way. They ought to be structured the opposite way. And so rather than beating up on Europeans for not having their novel ideas sooner, I think an interesting question is, well, how'd they come up with these novel ideas, many of which still aren't shared by people in other civilizations today? So how did that come to be, right? In other words, it's change that's interesting, not, well, in 3000 BC, things were this way, in 2000, in 1000, 1500, and then at the settlement of Virginia, things were always the same. And so obviously the Virginians were awful for being like everyone else. I don't think that's an interesting story. And it actually has a little bit of dishonesty about it. I think obviously it's tendentious.
Right. All right. I think tendentious is perhaps a better word than peculiar on which to end an interview about the 1619 project. Thank you so much for agreeing to be an interviewee. It's been lovely hearing from you, and I trust our viewers will enjoy this as much as I have.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.